In the Middle East, there were three religions that dominated the Western world: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of these religions are monotheistic and believe that their one God created and rules the universe. So at this point, we're going to move on from the Roman world, which is predominantly polytheistic and allows for the worship of many different gods, to these three faiths that are very much centered on the idea of one God. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, we do have peoples that worship the Jewish God and the Christian God. Of course, Islam comes later. First, I'm going to talk about Judaism and how it relates to art that was being created for Jewish patrons towards the end of the Roman Empire. But before I do so, let's talk a little bit about the history of Judaism and how the stories of Judaism will relate to the works of art that we are going to look at. Now, the history of Judaism that I'm about to give you is very fast, very basic. This is not the history from a religious studies class. These are just a few of the key events, key people, and key stories that we need to know before we dive into early Jewish art. God made a covenant with the people known as the Hebrews. These were the chosen people that awaited the appearance of the Messiah. They lived in Canaan, which in the 2nd century BCE was known as Palestine, which is its Roman name. The first story we should talk about is the story of Moses, because he will come up in some of the art we are going to look at. Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt to Canaan. And on this journey, he climbs Mount Sinai and is given the 10 Commandments, which by God. And he inscribes these on stone tablets and puts them in a container called the Ark of the Covenant. No one knows what the Ark of the Covenant looks like, but via popular culture, and we can think of Indiana Jones, for example, it's often imagined to look something like this top image I'm showing you. In the 10th century BCE, King Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant. And by all accounts, this was a very grand temple with many courtyards and chambers. And in the innermost chamber, there was a room called the Holiest of Holies that was guarded by an attendant angel. And this is the room where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar II exiled the Jewish people from Jerusalem, and he destroyed King Solomon's temple. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylonia and allowed the Jewish people to return home. Eventually, this area becomes part of the Roman Empire, and Herod the Great, who ruled between 37 BCE and 4 CE, rebuilt the Jewish temple. Eventually, the Romans destroy the temple and carry off the sacred objects back to Rome. At this point, the Jewish people are dispersed and establish communities throughout the Roman Empire. So that is the context for the early art of Judaism. But there is one particular problem with creating art for the Jewish faith and for Jewish patrons, which is the 2nd commandment, which I have written in red below. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven or above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. Now you can imagine that this is very problematic for artists. Judaism took this law very seriously. Thou shalt not make any graven image. That means that there can be no idols, no images of God or any prophets. So we'll see in the art of Judaism, there is very few figural representations. The first objects and the first images that we'll see are very much based on objects, still lifes, and symbolic representations of the faith. You can imagine then that art in the years of the Roman Empire, when Jews were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, that art is very few and far between. Some of the few representations we have that we know were made for the Jewish faith and for Jewish patrons are in the catacombs in Rome. Catacombs are underground cemeteries with tunnels on different levels, and they have niches that were meant for urns or sarcophagi, and they're often organized in different rooms, incorporate different rooms. And they are extremely eerie and creepy. If you go to the catacombs in Rome, you often will see human remains, bones, skulls, and that sort of things. I highly recommend if you ever have a chance to go and visit the catacombs. It's an extraordinary experience. This is what they look like. Catacombs were actually used by Christian people, Roman people, and Jewish people. And this is really in the period that is the late Roman Empire and the Hellenistic period. So you can imagine that the art that we see in this in these areas are displaying the influence of Roman and Hellenistic imagery. The art that we see are wall paintings in these catacombs. And here is one that shows images within a lunette frame. A lunette is a half moon shaped niche, and usually a lunette is over a doorway or a window. You can see that above the upper register of this lunette, we see two menorahs, the illusionistic representation of two menorahs. Menorahs are 7-branched lamps that in the Jewish faith, some think represent the ancient tree of life, the end of exile, and the promise of paradise to come. They are represented flanking an object that looks very much like what we might imagine the Ark of the Covenant to look like. There is some attempt here for illusionism. We see a little bit of shading. That you can see that they are meant to look as though they are sitting on a shelf in this lunette. There is also the representation of a curtain here. That would ostensibly be pulled down to cover these objects. It is, however, extremely flat, very linear. We see a lot of line drawings with just a minimal attempt at shading. For example, if we look at this object here, which might be a piece of fruit, we see a little bit of shading around the side. So there is some knowledge and some appreciation for Roman illusionism, but it is still meant to be very flat and just depict these objects. And we certainly see no figural representations that could be confused with God or the prophets.